the sort of first few drafts are like not creative process. The beginning of a translation, it's like building a wall with bricks. International publishers have just had no interest at all in Indian translation. When I was young, I mean, you're just forced to take languages, right? So I was taught French from grade 5 and Latin from grade 7. But I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, you just have an affinity to some things, right? So I always enjoyed learning languages, but Latin, the way Latin is taught is very specifically translation based because it's not a spoken language. I don't know if Sanskrit is taught that way in India, but it is taught that way in the United States. So you learn how to translate texts, because you're not learning how to buy things in the market or something like that, or saying hello. So you just, straight up, as soon as you know enough Latin, then you're reading Julius Caesar. So it's not very casual or anything. But anyway, you're trained as a translator when you're studying classical languages in the United States. I don't speak for other things. So that was a kind of an early translation experience for me, and I really just enjoyed the process. And then when I went on to high school, I had more choices. So I started learning German, and I continued with French and when Latin, and then in college I added on more because I had more options, because there were, in the American university system is so very different from Indian. So you were encouraged to sort of explore our interests, and like it's a giant buffet or something like that. So that's when I picked up Hindi, because I could just say, like, I wanted to try something totally different, because I had done Latin and Greek and French and German, and those are all sort of linked in a way. And Hindi, of course, is also Indo-European, but it's just also very different. And it was a huge challenge for me. It was much more difficult than the other ones, even though it's not a complex classical language. And I studied a bit of Sanskrit at that time as well. More options I had than the more languages I explored. I had, right at the end of my undergraduate degree, I was in an advanced Hindi class, which was mostly graduate students and me. And the teacher wanted us to try literary translation, actually. And so he gave us each a passage, like a page from just he was kind of eccentric man. So this completely wide variety of literature, according also to our abilities, because we had extremely, like, some of the people there were, native speaker Indians, like, so way beyond my level, because I was still struggling. So I was given Mohan Rakesh's Andhere Band Kamre. That's a classic from the 60s. So, and it's a classic of a certain genre of Hindi literature that explores the sort of alienation of urban life, that, as the sort of the sense that maybe the joint family is falling apart and people are moving into cities and living alone. And so there's this sense of alienation. So you can tell from the title that it's very depressing in its theme. But anyway, so I was given that, and it's fairly straightforward Hindi. Like, other people were given crazy things like, the Padmavat, like things in, Braj Bhasha verse and stuff like that, because they were much more advanced than me. So Mohan Rakesh is like very straightforward Hindi, like should, with a little bit of Hindustani. Anyway,
Yeah.
I just given this one page, and I just, enjoyed it immensely. This is the whole process of translating it. So, this was before I'd ever read, a book in Hindi. I'd read passages here and there and short stories and stuff like that, but I never even read a book cover to cover. But that just drew me in completely. Like, I knew that I would work on literature in graduate school from that one tiny exercise. I actually think it's completely different. Even though I think both are authors and both are doing something creative. But for one thing, when you translate, the sort of first few drafts are like not creative process, like it's like a slog, it's like digging a ditch or something like that. You just have to make sure you've gotten everything correct, like you have to just go through it word by word by word. So like, it's not like this, like an author can write this, this beautiful thing, and yes, it's hard work, but they can still kind of, just be like writing off the top of their head, so like it can be like this intensely creative. And I know that there are some creative writers who feel that they're slogging through their process too, but it's not the same. We're like, the beginning of a translation, it's like building a wall with bricks, or actually taking apart a brick wall and then rebuilding it, like it's this is very it's very unglamorous what we have to do. And so the creative part comes later, because what you're doing when you're taking apart that brick wall and rebuilding it is you're making it no longer the source language. So it's becoming, in my case, an English book. So once I've got it all done, and I heard a funnier analogy. I was just saying brick walls, but here's a funnier analogy. Is like, those Lego kits?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, say somebody gives you one that's already been done up really nice, like Hogwarts Castle, all constructed. So then the translator has to take the entire thing apart and then make a different type of building, because it's a different language, right? So it's not going to be the same. So it's a creation that's different, like it has a resemblance, it has all the components, but if it's not in Hindi anymore and it's in English, then it's never going to be exactly the same, right? So you have to make something new. And then the next part of the process is more creative. That's when you have to make it something that lives in English. Like it's not just technically in English, it breathes in English and it works in English. And then at that point, there's this kind of interesting process where you have to think about the voice of the original work, the voice of the author, and the tone. And you have to think, how would that voice sound if it were in English? So at that point, it's not only creative, but it's also almost a bit like a kind of a psychic process, because you're trying to kind of pull that essence into your own writing. So you're channeling, like when a psychic like is inhabited by a spirit or something like that, and then they start speaking in a different type of voice. I keep watching Korean dramas, and there's always these characters where they suddenly start talking in a little baby voice or something is there. And so that's sort of what it's like. So like, it's sort of funny for when I translated Red Samadhi, because Geetanjali does, she speaks English perfectly. She could have translated her book. She's not a translator. She doesn't want to translate, but she technically would be capable of doing it if she wanted to. So I have to channel this person who already speaks English, but I don't believe that what her Hindi book feels like would sound the same if I just made it sound the way she sounds in English, because we don't always speak the same way in different languages, right? So like a lot of, I think Indian English can be very formal. And so you lose, if you translate it into very standard Indian English, you can lose a lot of kind of the simplicity or the intimacy of the original language. So I had to channel what I felt like Geetanjali would write like in English if she were not Indian, sort of. Well, I mean, I don't want to say that that you have to be outside completely, but I think you have to have an awareness. And part of the problem with translating South Asian literature is there is a huge audience inside India for translated literature because not everybody reads all the same languages, right? So whether it's between non-English languages or into English, there is a big audience. So that's kind of how things have gone in the trends of South Asian literary translation, is that the audience, the assumed audience, is in India. So people like you, right, like that are English educated and tend to read in English, are the ones that will read these translations. So they, I mean, it's, you don't hear this about other types of translation, but I feel like I have to wrestle with this sort of like a kind of a continuum of how translated the book gets. You know, like there are degrees of translation. How much are you going to translate? How far are you going to push it out of that original language? Because Indian readers actually get really annoyed if you take it too far. They think it's too far. So like if you take it to the point that you think someone would want it if they were sitting across the world, Indian readers feel like you've over translated. So like family relationship terms, for example, is a big problem because especially in women's writing, there's like a lot of characters won't even have names given. So it's all kinship terms. So it's like somebody is a beti, but they're also a didi and they're also a bahu, and you know, and it's all relative. That's a really, really, really hard to translate because you cannot teach, like you can't force the reader, if they don't know these terms, you can't force them to learn an entire kinship system. That's just too hard, right? It's too much to ask. But the problem is that English speakers in India tend to use the kinship terms of their mother tongues while they're speaking English, right? Yeah. So like you still say bahu and beti and that kind of thing, even if you speak almost entirely in English all the time, right? You don't say like my sister's husband's brother or whatever, like you use the terms. So people get annoyed if you take them out because they feel like that's part of English, but it's too much. It's too much of a burden for people who know nothing at all. So I have to kind of create these illusions. Like I create the illusion that the terms are left in, but I've actually taken most of them out. So for example, in Ret Samadhi, the main characters, none of them have names. There's Beti, Bade, Ma, Bahu, yes. Right? And then, so I use those terms but I use them like their name. Like, so they might as well be Bob and Sally and, Susan or something like that. But I take out everything else. There's no Gigi and no Devrani and no none of this stuff. Okay, so I throw the rest out. And so that way I create an illusion that that I've left them in, but I have actually tossed out most of it. So that's what I was saying, is that I have that awareness that it's too much.
Yeah.
And I think, somebody living elsewhere outside of India would also probably grasp that.
Yeah.
Understand how much is too much. And that's what I was trying to drive at, is this idea of how translated a book is. I've never heard anyone talk about that with Russian or Japanese or something. Nobody talks about degrees of translation, but when we're talking about South Asian literature, there is this kind of continuum that we have to slide around on, how far are we going to go? And the one thing that makes it really hard is also that India is so multilingual that people are always speaking multiple languages at once, even within a sentence. Whereas say Americans are just extremely monolingual. So they never would do that. Even if they are themselves bilingual or something, they have the times when they speak Spanish and the times when they speak English, but they rarely mix it up the way that Indians do. So that makes it extremely difficult because, again, I think only an outsider would understand how monolingual the rest of the world can be. And Indians it's very hard to comprehend if you've never lived outside of India, how plain it is, kind of, in terms of a linguistic landscape. I mean, I'm sure that people living in India can figure this out, but in some ways it's sort of what's exciting about the shortlisting is that Indian translators can sort of see what it took for me to get attention for an Indian book, how far did I push the language out? And so it's it might sort of inspire them to think about international audiences, because the fact is that another problem is that international publishers have just had no interest at all in Indian translation. So everyone I know has tried. We've tried all different ways with agents, directly, networking. There's hardly anything has been published outside of India. So there's this huge amount going on inside of India and in Pakistan, Bangladesh to a lesser degree. And it's not getting out at all. And nobody wants it. And so so that also makes people stop trying. Why bother writing for an international audience if nobody wants it, Well, I mean, you can't say that any translation necessarily is better than the original. But there are some things, for example, and I'll give you a Japanese example. A lot of the world's editing kind of practices are pretty sloppy. So even in Japanese, where you wouldn't think that was the case, the editors don't do much. So Murakami, the famous Japanese novelist Murakami, he sends in a manuscript to his publishers, and they don't do they fix typos or something, but they don't do anything to it, right? And he's annoyed because he knows, he reads in English and he knows there's a better way. So his books get edited. He said this, they get edited when they're translated into English, and they're often 200 pages shorter even. And he allows this because he values that kind of close editing practice. And that editing practice doesn't just exist in the US or the UK, but Indian English publishers also follow those kinds of practices. So it's the entire English ecosystem believes in really a strong editing hand. So his English books, his English translations become the basis. He wants those to be the basis for all the other translations. So if you're going to translate Murakami into Serbian or French, Mongolian, it's going to come out of English. That's what he wants, because he says that's the edited version of his book, except for Chinese. The Chinese ones go directly from Japanese to Chinese, so they're like super extra long. Some of his books are big, right? So I think that's a really good example of how a translation can be better. And that's not a question of necessarily literary merit, but just that it's kind of been pulled together better. It's a better edited book. Like I always find in Hindi books are just full of typos. They have missing pages. Like it's a disaster. And like Geetanjali found a lot of typos through when the French translator and I both found a bunch of things. And so then they did a reissue of Reet Samadhi. That's why I have a painting on it. So it went directly from French into Hindi into French. But we both found typos. So she had to she redid, put out a new edition of Reet Samadhi after we translated it. It was one of the few books that wasn't my idea to translate, because Deborah Smith, who is the Korean translator and founder of Tilted Axis Press, was kind of scouting out Hindi titles, and she read a previous translation, by Geetanjali Shree, and she had heard from Arunava Singha, the Bangla translator, that there was this new one. So she was curious about it. And she said, who could translate it? And Arunava recommended me. So he was kind of the matchmaker. And and I actually hadn't read the whole book before I translated it, which is also unusual. So to be honest, I thought it was going to be my first sort of totally non-partition related book. And I was wrong. and I even got to a point where like there are quotes from books I've translated and I could just pull them out of my previous translations and stick them in, from Tamas and stuff. Yeah, so that one, there's one that stands out. It's a passage in which the human brain is compared to a jalebi, and which was so hard, just unimaginably hard, because it's written in this kind of fun, breezy way, like so it's very vague. There's sort of a vague way in which connections are made, but a translator, I can make it sound vague too, but I have to know what's underlying it. And so Geetanjali and I had to go back and forth, again and again and again, some like phrases just again and again and again. So we communicated all through email. So just over and over and over and over. And she would start to say, well, does it really matter? Like, it's just about a jalebi, right? Yeah. And I say, yes, but I have to get it right. So, and then I finally realized when I was pretty much done with that part that if I was successful, it would just be this sort of witty little, bit of the book that people would sort of read it and laugh, ha ha, and then keep going. Like they would never know that it was the most difficult thing I'd ever translated. And that is in fact the case, that nobody notices it really that much.